From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, August 23rd. After weeks of uncertainty, we got an answer this week on whether the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office will help enforce Portland's new ban on where unhoused people can set up camp. It turns out they will. That's likely going to be very important as Portland tries different ways to address camping. Today, we'll dive into what the sheriff's decision means, and we're also going to talk about how Portland's experience plays into a larger conversation happening on the state level about changing laws related to camping. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
And I'm OPB Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski.
Welcome back, Alex. This week, you reported on another turn of the screw in this public dispute, this very public dispute, actually, between the Multnomah County Sheriff, Nicole Morrissey O'Donnell, and Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler over how to enforce the city's new camping ban, or whether to enforce it in some ways. You and I have talked a lot about this ban on the podcast. We talk a lot about homelessness on this podcast, but just give us a refresher. Where did the conversation begin?
Right. So listeners will probably remember that Portland City Council passed this ban in May. And what it does is ban camping in certain public areas like parks and sidewalks, and also doing certain activities at a camp, like building a fire or digging into the ground or dismantling bikes. Anyone found violating this policy is first offered a spot in a shelter or other social services that might help them relocate. The city says it does this a few times before bringing in the penalties, which are either a fine of up to $100 or a sentence of up to 7 days in jail. So the city began enforcing this policy in late July. But when the police made their first arrest under the ban and brought that person in to jail, they were basically turned away. They were, told that the jail couldn't accept someone on these charges. This was all under the direction of Sheriff Morrissey O'Donnell, who oversees the jail. Her reasoning was twofold. In a strongly worded statement, she decried the very basis of this camping ban, saying that criminalization is the wrong solution to the region's homelessness crisis, and that she didn't want her jails contributing to that response. She also called out Mayor Ted Wheeler, who had introduced the new policy and has been kind of responsible for its rollout. She said that he hadn't followed the right steps to ensure that the jail would be able to hold people under this new policy. That was something I didn't really realize, that under state law, the county isn't required to jail people for violating city ordinances, only felonies or misdemeanors. That it's really on the city to ask permission of the sheriff to jail someone for violating a city-level rule, since the sheriff might not have enough space in the jail or staff capacity to do so. This is pretty unique to Portland, since many Oregon cities have municipal jails built just to hold people who break city laws. Wheeler, for his part, said that he met with the sheriff a few times to discuss this new ban, but he said he didn't believe he needed any kind of special sign-off to bring people to the jail.
Yeah, this very Portland-y talking past each other thing where, I've talked to the sheriff a bunch of times, but all of a sudden I'm completely blindsided that she won't. But the important thing, and the thing we are here to talk about, is that now Sheriff Morrissey O'Donnell's tune has changed. What is happening?
Yeah, so she spent the last few weeks meeting with Wheeler to get a better understanding of the new policy, specifically the part where the city is offering services and shelter spots before any penalties. She said that she was pretty convinced by the city's commitment to make jail really the last resort in the process. So she has now agreed to book people in jail for violating this policy for the next 4 months just to see how it goes. She also added one more opportunity to get people connected to services and housing. Basically, after someone is booked on this charge in the jail, county staff will ask if that person wants to move into shelter or get connected with other services like mental health care or detox. If they accept it at that point, it sounds like they can still have their charges reversed, kind of like the last fail-safe effort. Morrissey O'Donnell told me that she just wants to make sure that they're exhausting all opportunities to get support before sticking someone with a criminal record, and that she'll take the next 4 months to measure its effectiveness. Here's how she explained it.
We will be collaboratively evaluating this process as it begins and regularly to ensure that we're able to not only provide those services on the front end, but to be able to engage with someone if they were brought into our booking center and make sure that we're covering our gaps as well to provide someone the best path forward.
So from what I've heard from people close to the sheriff, she might not be totally confident that the city is really offering enough options to people to avoid jail. And so she wants to combine resources.
It makes me wonder, we often hear about the problems that happen within governance of things that sound simple, like I'm a governmental entity and I'm going to connect you with services. And then the real life on the ground difficulties, it's often a lot more complicated than it sounds. And it just makes me wonder how well the county jail and the sheriff are set up to do these kinds of referrals that they're saying are going to happen. I mean, it sounds like it could be simple. It also sounds like the kind of thing that we learn in 3 months hasn't been happening because there's some crazy logistical thing. Does she have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there is a program that's very similar to the city's kind of outreach programs. I think it's called the HOPE Team. I forget what it stands for, but it's a group of deputies in the sheriff's office who go out and offer support services to people who are camping in the county outside of the Portland city limits. There's often a lot of folks going out to 100 acres on the Sandy River that are camping out there, kind of, offering support and options and everything. And from what I've heard, I think she has learned through the lens of that it takes time and it's not something that can just be easily stuck on someone. Here's shelter. You're now resolved. And so I think from what I've heard, her thinking is we need to just throw more options at this and more pathways out.
Okay. Yeah. So, but there are existing mechanisms within the office that she can potentially use. So what happens after the 4 months? We have this pilot program, this training, or this trial run, I guess. What is the significance of the 4 months? Where did that number come from?
Yeah, that's not very clear yet. It does seem to be coming from the sheriff, who wants enough time to really measure how the system is working. What stood out to me is that, 4 months from now is mid-December, which will be just weeks before Portland gets a brand new city council and mayor and a new district attorney.
Right.
That timing may mean this conversation will need to be hashed out all over again in 2025, and I can't tell if that's intentional. As a reminder, Mayor Wheeler will be out of office next year, but Morrissey O'Donnell's term does not expire until 2026.
So back to the camping ban. The sheriff hasn't been letting police bring people to her jail for this whole time that it's been in place. So has it just not been enforced? What has actually happened?
Yeah, so it's been enforced, but not to the extent that the city would like it to be. Since people can't be taken and booked into jail, they really can't be arrested. So officers are just writing up citations, which, give people a court date and could leave them with a fine if a judge determines that makes sense. But the handcuffs aren't really coming out yet.
Right, and we have seen what can happen when you write tickets or citations to people in marginalized situations. It is not always the best or most successful public policy, I would say.
Right, they add up.
What changes now then? I mean, should we expect the jail to be inundated? Have people been arrested? What do we know?
So I think part of the answer is that so far, it's been a couple weeks since this policy has been in place. There's been about 7 citations that could have been arrests. So it's not this huge flood of people kind of coming into the jails. I don't think that's what we'll see. But more people will be taken to jail. What I do need to point out, though, is that it's very unlikely people arrested for violating this will be held in jail. They will be brought into the jail and booked, where you get fingerprinted, get a mugshot taken, and have your info entered into the court system. But unless that person is deemed a threat to public safety or there's some warrant out for their arrest, they'll probably just be released. That is until their trial date, where they make it a sentence.
Well, this comes amid this big change, obviously, in how states are able to criminalize people who don't have a house. Earlier this summer, as we've discussed, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that arresting or fining people who are sitting or sleeping in public didn't amount to cruel, unusual punishment under the Constitution. That was especially big for Western states like Oregon, who'd been operating under this appeals court ruling that really restricted enforcement of various anti-camping laws. But in Oregon, as we've discussed, this had a muted impact. That's because of this state law that requires that city ordinances against camping be, quote, objectively reasonable. That is the language in state statute. How does this all interact with the camping ban? Are we legit under state law? I mean, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So one piece of the camping ban I didn't get into is that it can only be enforced if there are shelter beds available for people to relocate to. This rule is meant to meet the objectively reasonable requirement that you mentioned, that it would be unreasonable to ask people to leave if they have nowhere to go. To be clear, the city has far less shelter beds available than it needs to meet its entire unhoused population right now, but there are a handful of emergency beds made available every day to accommodate people who may be in violation of the camping ban and could take them up in the offer. So this step is a point of contention for some city officials following the Supreme Court ruling, because that ruling doesn't require reasonableness. And some leaders think that it should override the Oregon law to let cities arrest people without having enough shelter beds at the ready. Just last week, I saw City Commissioner Rene Gonzalez posting on social media about how he's worried that unhoused people will flock to Oregon from other states, kind of becoming a sanctuary state of sorts due to its softer camping policies. So people like Gonzalez and others have been petitioning state lawmakers to change the state statute next year. And, actually, this kind of brings to mind something that you've been following, Dirk, on how the state legislature is responding to these calls for change. A couple weeks ago, you reported on a letter that a group of Democrats sent to Oregon's top lawmakers. Can you remind us what they asked?
Yeah. So they are basically asking that the legislature take a deep dive into whether this law on the books that we're talking about is still appropriate in light of this summer's Supreme Court decision. And we should just back up. This was a bill that was passed by lawmakers in 2021, which was, I think, a very different political time in some ways than we see in Oregon today. At the time, Governor Tina Kotek was the House Speaker, very engaged in housing issues, and she was really the driving force behind this bill. And it was sort of an attempt by Oregon to codify the prevailing court opinion at the time, which as we mentioned, it said you can't outlaw camping if people don't have some place for them to go. You can't just say you can't sleep here and you can't sleep anywhere. But as I said, what Oregon actually put into law was that any camping bans be, as we talked about, objectively reasonable, which I think is a statement that doesn't have a ton of intrinsic meaning, right? What is objectively reasonable to you might not be objectively reasonable to me. In fact, it's very subjective.
It really sets the path for legal challenges, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much you can argue about what objectively means. And without a court ruling, which we don't have right now, there hasn't been a challenge that has risen to any level where authority has been asserted by a court. There's just not much clarity on exactly how this law restricts cities from enacting camping ban. It's probably pretty safe to say cities can't completely outlaw camping without offering people any other resources. That doesn't seem reasonable in any respect, but other than that, it's not super clear. Anyway, that's the background. There was a letter sent by 7 centrist Democrats, 4 representatives, 3 senators. And what they requested is that the House Speaker, Julie Fahey, and Senate President Rob Wagner create a work group, a legislative work group that could bring in experts and lawyers and really drill into how the state might change the law to give cities more clarity in this new environment.
And it's not just this relatively small group of Democrats calling for change, right?
No. Republicans really didn't like this bill when it passed. Almost none of them voted for it. And now, since the Supreme Court decision, they have labeled it the Right to Camp bill. They, much like Commissioner Gonzalez, have been saying, this bill is ripe. It's to sort of attract homeless people to Oregon because we see states like California that are cracking down more forcefully on homeless camps and other states and the rest. So we're just going to see people flocking to the state because they know it's easier here. I think that is very unproven, to say the least. I mean, it is clear that cities are moving forward with anti-camping policies, even under Oregon law. So to say that we are the Wild West with no regulations is just not correct.
And so what kind of response has all of this received from leaders in the legislature that they're lobbying? Yeah.
Everything we've heard from the House Speaker and Senate President has been, I guess I'd say, unenthusiastic about this idea. Neither is signaling any interest in creating a special work group to take this up all on its own. They've said, anyone who wants to consider changes to the law can put forward a bill or a proposal via the normal legislative committee process, just like anyone else. But that route doesn't necessarily seem super likely either for big changes. And that's because the top 2 lawmakers when it comes to housing policy in the legislature, who are Senator Casey Jama and Representative Pam Marsh, both have said they don't see right now any big need for change. They think that the law we have on the books is guiding cities toward responsible policy around camping. And so they don't seem very interested in taking up the matter with any real energy in their committees, at least right now.
So there's a lot that state lawmakers want to tackle in the next legislative session that we've talked about in this podcast. Is it fair to say that we shouldn't expect any significant changes to kind of camping bans in this law in particular during next year's legislative session?
I would not be comfortable saying that. things can change very, very quickly. And there are a number of things that I think are going to have an impact on that. The first is that we haven't heard from the group that lobbies on behalf of cities just how big a legislative push it will make to get lawmakers to revisit the law. That group is the League of Oregon Cities. It's still finalizing its goals for next year's session. And I think that, if it decides this is an all-out priority, we could see some shift. The second is that there does actually seem to be at least some openness toward adding some clarity to the law from Governor Kotek, who, remember, was the person who pushed the bill that created this law in the first place. She was asked about this by OPB's Think Out Loud recently and had this to say.
When I helped on that bill when I was Speaker of the House, we had folks from the cities, we had advocates there. Everybody sat down and said, what's the best way to do this, to provide clarity for the cities? If it's not clear, they should go back to the drawing board. But again, I will say that some cities are doing just fine. They have figured it out. Maybe Portland's more complex because it's larger. But without court interpretation, perhaps the legislature has to define that.
So, we have an opening from the top Democrat in the state. She clearly is signaling she'd be willing to at least consider a bill that comes to her desk. I think that creates some space for a conversation. Remember, there are also significant numbers of lawmakers calling for this, right? I talked about 7 moderate Democrats, but if you link them or add them up to all the Republicans, that becomes a pretty big group. In the Senate alone, that would account for the majority of the Senate. And I'm not saying those Democrats are going to hop in league with the Republicans and launch a coup in the Senate. But, you get those kinds of numbers and it does start to move the needle a little bit in the legislature. And I just think that has to be a factor in any of this. If the Republicans really, really are banging the gong and some Democrats are seeing the reason there, then we might see a pretty in-depth discussion about this. But as we often say in this podcast, we will be following that and probably be talking about that more in the future. Okay, this has been a great discussion, kind of nerdy like usual, but I'm sure we'll keep talking about the Portland camping ban and all things camping policy in the state. Alex, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Nalene Silva, and our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting, as always, at opb.org. While you're there, why not become an OPB member? You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice. And as of, 2 weeks ago, you can find us on YouTube. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.